Thank you very much, everybody. It's really a wonderful honor to be here. Who would have thought that the Korean Americans would have the largest, most successful, most well-organized gathering of all the Asian groups in New York City, focused on community service. It's wonderful. Tribute to everybody. And I also want to recognize June and Sunny Huang, mostly because they're Dartmouth graduates, class of 1985. And I've known them since 1981, is it, Sunny? We met in 1982, because we were working on Asian student activities together, and we couldn't believe that there were these two Asians actually living in Hanover, New Hampshire at the time. So I give a lot of talks. Everywhere I go, I'm expected to make a speech. But I had to think long and hard about what I could tell this audience that might be meaningful. So what I did was I tried to think about what it would be like to just tell you my personal story. Now, it's very embarrassing to me. It's very embarrassing to me to talk about my life and my own history. I usually talk about problems in global health and such. But tonight, with this wonderful gathering of Korean Americans, I thought I'd go through a little bit of the way I think now as a college president about the opportunities I've had and the responsibilities for the future. You know, one of the books that I've really enjoyed reading recently, I don't get to read much anymore, but over the summer I read a little bit, Malcolm Gladwell and Outliers, a wonderful book that popularizes some of the most interesting research now on what it takes to be successful and what marks the most successful people in life, was following a pattern of books that had come out that said talent is overrated. It's really not about talent. And he writes this: everything we have learned says that success follows a predictable course. It's not the brightest who succeed, nor is success simply the sum of decisions and efforts we make on our own behalf. It is rather a gift. Outliers are those who have been given opportunities and who've had the strength and presence of mind to seize them. To build a better world, we need to replace the patchwork of lucky breaks and arbitrary advantages that today determine success, the fortunate birth dates and the happy accidents of history, with a society that provides opportunities for all. Now, isn't it wonderful that we're here tonight to support an organization who's trying to level the playing field and provide opportunities for all? But it also made me think a lot about the not just happy accidents, but the crazy, improbable circumstances that led to my being here today. This is my mother and father's wedding, right here in New York City. Talk about improbable. My father escaped from North Korea when he was 17, happened to know a border guard, so got through to the South. Without a penny to his name, he somehow got himself admitted to Seoul National University Dental School. He went to dental school, worked very hard to learn English, was taken in under their wing by some American dentists who sent him to New York University, right here, to do some postgraduate training. My mother was a student at Gyeonggi High School, did very well. During the war, had to walk from Seoul to Masan, where Gyeonggi High School was reconstituted. And then from war-torn Masan Gyeonggi High School, people from an organization called PEO, a secret women's society based in the United States, came to Masan and offered scholarships to exactly 2 women. She came to Scarrett College in Tennessee in the early 1950s, and out of sheer boredom in Tennessee, decided to go to a Korean party in New York. At that Korean party in New York, she ran into my father. My father was smitten. He sent letter after corny love letter to Tennessee. My mother, who's a very cerebral type, couldn't understand what the hell was wrong with this guy. But eventually, they continued their romance. My mother was, again, completely unexpectedly admitted to Union Theological Seminary here in New York City, where she studied with people like Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, some of the greatest theologians and thinkers of the 1950s. And she and my father married in New York. So my brother was born here in New York City, but then, as students had to at that time, went back to Korea. Here I am at about 1.5 or 2 years old with my father, who taught at Seoul National University and Yonsei University Dental School. My mother taught philosophy and theology at Ewha, and we thought we had a pretty good life. But what was happening around that scene? There were students in the streets. There were military conflicts. There was so much instability that my parents decided that the only chance that we would have to lead a normal, productive life might just be to come to the United States. So again, through the kindness of strangers, a dentist in Dallas, Texas, whom my father had met through the war, invited my father to come to Dallas. Now, he was a professor of dentistry, had gotten all his training, special training at New York University, but he had to start dental school from the first year all over again. And so we lived in a very, very small apartment while my father finished dental school. Then, because my father was afraid that a Korean dentist, that Americans would not accept someone from Korea putting his hands in their mouth, we ended up in Muscatine, Iowa. Now, don't be too impressed. We lost every single game our senior year. But I led the sort of classic Korean-American Iowan life growing up. And, we learned what it's like to be in the middle, the heartland of the United States. But you can imagine, at least the only good thing about being in Iowa at that time was that Kung Fu was on TV. And at least they had some fear that we might know karate. But it was a challenge. I did play football. I did play basketball. Was there racism? Sure. But the racism in Iowa was more like assaults on our dignity. They made fun of us. They, taunted us to an extent. But my father was a dentist. My mother was finishing her PhD at the University of Iowa. And the racism that we experience is not like the racism that, for example, poor African Americans experienced in the South, and frankly still experience in the South sometime. It wasn't a racism mixed with classism that limited our opportunities. So how did I get from Muscatine, Iowa, to this crazy picture of me, president of Dartmouth College? Now, my father was a dentist. Dentists are among the most practical human beings on the face of the earth. My mother was a philosopher, studied with Reinhold Niebuhr, and had us reading Martin Luther King and newspapers from New York City even when we were young kids. My father, I have to tell you, my first semester after I returned from Brown University, he picked me up at the airport and we were driving home, and he said to me, "So what are you thinking of studying?" And I told my father, I'm really excited by philosophy and political science, and I'm really thinking of studying those two things, and I really want to go into politics. So we were on the highway, and he slowly pulled the car over to the side of the road. And I didn't speak Korean then, but if I had, he probably would have started his comments by saying, "Ya ima!" And he quite literally said, as calmly as he could, "Look, once you finish your residency, you can do anything you want." So here I was, my mother feeding me Martin Luther King books, my father telling me I had to be practical. So I did go to medical school. Though I also got a PhD in anthropology, and I spent time in Korea studying the healthcare system. But what I really wanted to do, and I think this dates back to when I was about 8 or 9 years old, was I thought that there were problems in the world, that there are injustices in the world, and that it was my responsibility to do something about them. So in 1987 and 1988, I worked with my colleagues to found an organization called Partners in Health. We now work in 9 countries. Tomsk is in Siberia, Rwanda, Malawi, Lesotho, all those great vacation spots that you must all go to on your holidays. But we did this, and we did this with great energy. And we did this at a time when there was almost no interest. Bill Gates had not discovered global health yet. President Bush had not announced his great initiative to treat people on HIV. We were living literally day to day, hand to mouth, volunteering our time, trying to earn money, working in the hospital while running this small organization. We had some successes. This is Caraballo, a community in Lima, Peru. We went there at the invitation of a group of Catholic priests, and we were going to do something very small. We were going to just try to help kids grow up healthier. But we found patients like this, patients who had something that we called drug-resistant tuberculosis. In other words, a form of tuberculosis that's resistant to the standard drugs. These people were so sick, they had been treated 5, 6, 7 times. They were infecting their neighbors and their family members who were dying. And we thought, we've got to do something about this. This is terrible because tuberculosis, as many of you know, is a disease that's spread through coughing. So it's spread inside people's homes. We kept saying, this is terrible. What are we going to do? Turns out the drugs to treat this disease were very, very expensive for reasons that I'll tell you later. And it turns out that our colleagues at the World Health Organization were saying, don't do anything about it. First they said, it's so complicated, it's impossible to treat. And it is complicated. It's one of the most difficult treatment regimens I've ever been involved with. Anywhere from 18 to 24 months of daily treatment, usually with an injectable. In other words, an intramuscular injection, usually in the buttocks, for an entire year. It's very difficult treatment. And yet, the only way to stop an epidemic of drug-resistant tuberculosis is to treat the people who have it. So here was the World Health Organization saying, don't do it, they usually die, it's impossible, it's too expensive, forget about it. So of course we started treating the patients, and we were very, very fortunate. Again, these extraordinary, unexpected accidents of fate that led us to one of the most saintly men I've ever known, Thomas J. White, a Boston Irish Catholic construction company owner who literally has given away every penny of his sizable fortune to help the poorest of the poor. He gave us the money to start. But the cost of the drugs was about $25,000 per person. Now, in a developing country, you don't even ever think about spending that much money for a single patient. But we knew some things. We knew that most of these drugs were generic drugs, so we didn't quite understand why they were so expensive. And we wanted to make a point. We wanted to make a point that you cannot put a dollar value on human life. That you cannot say that just because they're in a poor country, the fact that they have an epidemic disease that's spreading and killing family members is just not worth treating because they're poor. We were there once. As Koreans in the 1950s, that's just where we were. We would have been among those people who these bureaucrats would have said, I'm sorry, they're too poor. They're just not worth treating. So we figured out that, in fact, the drugs were all generic, and that if we put all our money together and try to get the Indian and Chinese drug companies to make these off-patent drugs, we might be able to lower the cost. And indeed, after about a year, we lowered the price of the medicines anywhere from 80 to 98%, making it still expensive, but altogether affordable. We did this with the almost unanimous opposition of the public health community. Now, the number of projects and treatment programs has gone up. We have now over 50,000 people on treatment throughout the world, but in 1996, when we started, there were 0 people on treatment in the world. This is a graph that shows you another disease process. These are life expectancy graphs from Africa. In other words, in some countries in Africa, we were seeing life expectancy drop 25 years in a matter of 10 or 15 years. In other words, in places like Botswana, for example, where life expectancy had reached 62, it dropped to 38 in a matter of a decade. This was HIV. HIV was decimating this population. And despite the fact that our great drug companies had found wonderful combination drugs that were keeping people in the United States alive indefinitely, the word was, emphasis must be placed on prevention. I'm sorry, the 30 million people in Africa who are infected are gonna have to die. So it was the same story, once again, and people made the same excuses. It's too complicated, these people are so poor. One American government official even said, Africans can't take these medicines because they can't tell time. They only know sun and night, and they don't have watches. To which a group of Africans whom that official had visited said, he can say that if he wants, but the only one who was ever late to all the meetings was that guy. So once again, a challenge. Once again, an effort to do something, to make a mark, to make an argument that in fact we can treat the people. So this is Joseph June. He's a friend of mine. He came to a clinic in Haiti in March of 2003. His mother came and asked us for a small donation so that she could buy his coffin. He was suffering from both HIV and tuberculosis. And as a last-ditch effort, his family had carried him 2 days on a stretcher into our clinic. We see people like this all the time in Africa and other places. You don't see people like this in the United States because we never let it get this bad. After a few months of treatment for both tuberculosis and HIV, he looked like this. We call this the Lazarus effect of HIV treatment. It convinced President Bush to commit $15 billion to treating people with HIV. In fact, President Bush's staff saw these very pictures because my colleague Paul Farmer was asked to go to the White House and answer the question, is it possible to treat people with HIV in developing countries? Joseph June is now one of the most famous Haitians in the world because when I was at the World Health Organization working for another great Korean who tragically passed away, Dr. Jong Lee, we put his before and after pictures on every document that went out of the World Health Organization. The Kenyans thought he was Kenyan. They told me for sure, no, he's Kenyan. The point, though, is that throughout Africa, people thought, now this is possible. We're not going to be left for dead. We can do this. So when I was at WHO with Secretary General Lee Jong-uk, I had run his campaign, so I was really his right-hand man when we were at the World Health Organization. We started a campaign. I had been studying a lot about management theory and the work of W. Edwards Deming and how to get a movement going so that people actually do something. And everything I read said you've got to have a concrete goal with a concrete end date. So I convinced Dr. Lee to declare that we were going to treat 3 million people by the end of 2005. It was already the middle of 2003, 2.5 years, and only about 150,000 people were in treatment. Well, we didn't make it, but we made it by 2007. So 3 million people who otherwise had been declared dead got treatment. We didn't do it all. President Bush's effort was extremely important. A lot of other people were very instrumental. But by setting a really bold target for which we took endless criticism, we got things moving. So 2 years late on a target, it turns out that that's the best the United Nations has ever done on any target. And so we're very proud of the fact that people are alive now who would otherwise not be. This is Karabayu again. And people ask me all the time, why would you give up all that for this? My wife asks me that all the time, living in Hanover. But here's why. John Sloan Dickey was Dartmouth's 12th president. He came from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State Department as head of public relations and took over as president of Dartmouth in 1945. In 1946, at the convocation of his first class, he told the students, "The world's troubles are your troubles. And there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. When I saw this, I thought, oh my goodness, is that what a college president does? Is that what's possible if you take over a college? You mean, is it possible for me to, instead of throwing my own body at particular problems like HIV and tuberculosis, is it possible to train thousands of young people to be so inspired and so on fire that they're going to go out and throw their bodies at problems? They're going to be so well trained that there will be no trouble that they can't fix. I kept going back to the search committee, is that what you want me to do? And they kept saying yes. You know, I had to negotiate a lot with my wife Yunsuk about whether or not we were going to move. She grew up near a city and she doesn't like small towns. So I kept going back and I kept saying, okay, they want me to go to the next stage of the interview process. Is it okay? And she'd look at me and she'd say, well, yeah, they'll never give you the job anyway. So this is now my job. I still am very involved in global health efforts, but my job now is to inspire young people to think that there's nothing that they can't take on, to make the world's troubles their troubles. Now, the question tonight is, have we, as the Korean American community, made the world's trouble our troubles? Well, this is a scene from Peru. Seeing people who live on garbage in Peru was very moving to me, and it moved me to want to do something to help. This is a scene from 1950 in Korea, people living on garbage. In 1950, we had about a 23% literacy rate in Korea. Our gross national product per capita was about the same as that of Haiti in 1950. This is a scene of a young woman marching from Seoul down south, fleeing the war. This could have been my mother. My mother would have been a little bit older then, but my mother carried her own youngest brother to Masan when they were fleeing. This is what Seoul looked like during the 1950s. Now, look at Seoul. We're the 11th largest economy in the world. You know, it's stunning to me to think that my father and my mother lived in conditions that were worse than some of the conditions I work in today. That's where we've come. So what is the nature of our responsibility now as Korean Americans? You know, many people felt the same pain that I felt in Peru and helped Korean Americans. Dentists in the Army made it possible for my father to get an education. The World Bank, the US government, invested billions of dollars into Korea. Admittedly, not entirely for altruistic purposes. Korea happened to be very important geopolitically. But the fact of the matter is that we are here today because of what Malcolm Gladwell would call happy accidents of fate. We happen to be in a war, but we happen to have people who wanted to help Korean Americans. It's the persistence of the workers, the young women who worked in the factories in the 60s and 70s in Korea. It's their persistence, it's their skill, it's their commitment to work that brought us here. Yes, indeed, we did a lot to bring us here. But now that we're here, what is indeed the nature of our commitment? What can we do to build a better world, to replace the patchwork of lucky breaks and arbitrary advantages that determine success, and build a society that provides opportunities for all? Moreover, is this an urgent task? Is it something that we think about once in a while? Is it something that we think about only when we're in church? Is it something that we think about only on evenings like this? Well, one of my favorite philosophers of all time is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King had a very clear vision of what it meant to have a sense of urgency. In Letters from a Birmingham Jail, he writes about an experience with what he calls a white moderate, who wrote to him and said, "All Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually. But it is possible that you are in too great a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth." To which Martin Luther King responded, Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time and a strangely irrational notion that there is something in the flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. By coming here tonight, you are helping the Korean American community break the silence. Koreans and Korean Americans have to make our voices heard. We must declare that the world's troubles are our troubles and that we're going to fix them one by one. Many happy accidents and your own persistence have brought you to the level, to the place where you can now be generous to the Korean American Community Foundation. You can do that. You've taken that first step. It's so important. And shamelessly, I'm going to tell you that I have filled out my card for $1 a day. And I'm going to ask you all to do the same, because breaking the silence costs money. Please give generously to the Korean American, to KACF. And I thank you for listening to my story. This is my family now. This was our gathering at my inauguration. My Korean American, Scottish American, African American family. You know, as I see you all here today, we're not such a small group. But I always try to remember what the great anthropologist, a member of my tribe, Margaret Mead, used to always say. Never doubt the capacity of a small group of committed souls to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you very much.